Hello, see this stonework with its perfect 3D curved fitting that we simply cannot explain how it was made? It's amazing, I know, but it goes beyond that. It reaches the other side of the world, literally, which is the only other place where we can find a similar type of construction. How did it get there? Well, that is a good question, one we will try to understand today. Polygonal walls are found in many places over the world, from exotic islands like Rapa Nui to right at the center of classical hubs like Athens. This global spread is sufficient for easily impressionable folks like myself to wonder about how ancient people share their experiences. A question that does not seem to bother the experts, always quick at dismissing Cyclopean works with simplifications, such as many of the Cyclopean works have different finishings, so they could be unrelated. This despite the fact that in many places like Mycenae there are three or four styles jumbled up in one same wall. Thus, different styles do not mean made by different people. Also, some of these walls are quite easy to achieve, with simpler shapes not very tight fitted. Thus, academics overblow these simpler cases as a smoke screen to ignore the really hard ones. Forget the builder's motivation to forego time-saving mortar and squared blocks and engaging in these overcomplicated construction techniques. And there is pottery, they say. Look at the random scribbles in pottery. Ignore the massive megalithic structures. Or even assuming ancient people never talked to one another, never left their village, lived and died in isolation in a closed campus, surrounded only by pottery shards. And finally, likely the main reason, agreeing with their PhD supervisor, who once said Cyclopean walls are not important, and now controls the grant distribution. On the other hand, those lacking the benefit of a formal education can get distracted by coincidental constructions like these two. One is in Alaka Oyuk, Turkey, dated to the 1500 BC, and not only we have no idea how it was done, the only other case with similar work is in Peru, over 12,000 kilometers away, and built arguably 3,000 years later, in 1500 AD. If two can be a coincidence, 10 should be more of a trend. However, academics have no limit to the number of commonplaces they can dismiss. For them, it is meaningless that some themes show up in various places, under different circumstances, and even arguably from different eras or cultures. Like these odd examples of intellectual property breach. The handbags carried by many gods. The three doors placed on top of pyramids. Elongated skulls. Doors to nowhere. Double-headed eagles. Nubs or bosses. The Lord of Animals, a strong man holding two beasts. Dolmens with little cat flaps. or the fish-scaled flying humanoids. Surely, all these persistent repetitions could happen by chance, as they say. But that implies ancient people would come up with cliches like fish-scaled birdmen holding bags over and over again for no reason, instead of, let's say, traveling and talking to one another. When it comes to serendipities, there is no better place than Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. This tiny speck of land, isolated in the Pacific Ocean, offers some insight into the way the ancient builders made coincidences. The island is famous for their mohai, a bunch of 900 similar statues with big heads that are scattered all around the place. Most of the mohai are eroded by the weather, so we no longer see the details of the work. But a few were buried for unclear reasons, and these have plenty of revealing quirks. For once, they are carved with little hands over their waist, similar to what we see, for example, in the T-pillars of Göbekli Tepe. Also, the big head giants are naked, except for a little tongue, similar to a sumo wrestler. Their skin is tattooed with many symbols, most of them we cannot properly understand, but are writing something. The inhabitants of Easter Island developed a writing system from scratch, something never heard of in an island. The natives also drew boats of the European style in the body of one of the mohai, as if anticipating the radical impact that encounter would have. And by far the most puzzling detail is to be found underneath some of the mohai. It's the platforms, some of them made with polygonal masonry, complete with fit-to-shape stones and inserted key blocks in clear Peruvian style. The type of similarities we cannot unsee, and academics insist it's but a coincidence. Naive people looking at the megalithic platforms holding the mohai in Easter Island would suspect they are related to the famous stone walls in Peru. That's because the stonework is similar and the distance does not seem out of reach. Plus, they are more or less dated to about the same era, around 1500 AD. So, it isn't so hard to think contact between the ancient Peruvians and the Polynesian in Easter Island may have occurred. However, that hypothesis is unacceptable for the masters of paperwork, who keep pushing variations of their Clovis first doctrine, a belief that people only arrived in America by foot after 12,000 BC. Before this Clovis rule, there was a similar dogma amongst the paper pushers called late entry, establishing 10,000 BC as the date for the first American walk-in. Recently, new discoveries in Monteverde, Chile, brought that human transit even earlier, in 13,000 BC, on the far extreme of the continent. And further finds in White Sands, New Mexico, are now showing that at least by 20,000 BC, humans were present in the continent. Academics resist all those evidences for an older arrival into the Americas, and likewise the relation between the platforms in Easter Island and the stonework in Peru, because they adhere to a cult that determines the continent was populated by foot over the Bering Strait, connecting Siberia to Alaska during an ice age, whilst us common folks suspect the trip would be more pleasant if done by boat. Officially, ocean sailing only began in the 1400s AD, when Portuguese explorers went all around Africa and crossed the Atlantic, the Indic, and even the Pacific Oceans, reaching basically everywhere. Easter Island took a bit longer. The island is so remote it remained hidden from view until Easter Sunday 1722, when a slightly misguided Dutch sailor called Jacob Roggeveen spotted it, to disprove that theory of ocean crossing being a relatively new invention and show how the Peruvian coast and the Easter Island could have been connected long before. In 1947, a deranged explorer called Thor Heyerdahl crossed from Peru to Easter Island in a glorified canoe named kon-tiki. His adventure was amazing, but still desk-bound academics insisted it proved nothing. So, lacking the sense of self-preservation, Thor doubled down and in 1970 crossed the Atlantic in a new ragtag boat, this time named Ra-2. Unmoved both by the kon-tiki and the Ra-2 successes, academics continued to say ocean crossing was impossible, leading a new generation of nutcase sailors to launch the Abora 5 expedition, trying to connect America with Europe in a Bronze Age replica ship. Back in Europe, the most impressive Cyclopean works, including that one in Alaka Oyuk, are dated to the Bronze Age, a period when people in Europe had bronze. Surprising, I know, since bronze is of no help in building these Cyclopean feats of stonemasonry. Regardless of what was the bronze used for, the Bronze Age meant people would be sailing up and down around the continent. Because to achieve bronze one needs to mix two minerals, tin and copper mostly, that do not exist in the same place. Thus, the Bronze Age man had to cross the Mediterranean Sea many times to supply blacksmiths with the ingredients to produce this metal for the ages. In fact, the size and quality of the ships sailing in Europe during the second millennium BC, or the Bronze Age, was quite impressive, even if by then they were not new technology, since at least 1,000 years before the Egyptians had both some fine polygonal walls and equivalent large boats. And long before all that, really long, like 15,000 years ago, people were already going back and forth within the Greek islands, arguably by boat, to trade on obsidian, a volcanic glass very popular in those times. All this proves seafaring was established and common in Europe since the Ice Age, at least, allowing for a connected continent that could feed a lot of coincidences, like dolmens with little cat flaps. Sure, people were sailing the Mediterranean Sea since at least the Paleolithic. That's when that obsidian carry trade was booming. But where is the evidence for crossing full-sized oceans back then? That evidence is on Easter Island. No, it is not the kon-tiki expedition, nor the big-headed mohai, nor even polygonal platforms underneath the statues. The evidence that people were crossing the oceans in the Paleolithic is the people living in that tiny island with only Paleolithic technology. The Polynesian, the original inhabitants of Easter Island, arrived there with nothing more than boats built with tools that already existed 15,000 years ago. If the Polynesian could manage to cross the biggest ocean and settle a full-size civilization with nothing more than reeds and hemp, what was stopping the many fishermen and obsidian traders in Europe or Africa to end up in the Americas? Nothing, obviously. Since at least 15,000 years ago, not only sailing across the ocean was possible, it was even frequent, at least in one-way trips. All it took was a bad weather day, hitting a lost obsidian trader, and off he went onto the other side of the sea. Getting back was more problematic for sure, but one-way trips would be enough to establish contact and convey all sorts of crazy ideas, such as the nubs, doors to nowhere, myths of seafaring gods and deluges, and even bird fishmen with handbags. All these things and many other so-called coincidences could easily be ideas brought in by castaways, and not, as academics insist, some sort of fixed fate embedded in history. The Portuguese in the 15th century basically introduced the round trip, the ability to return home after being stranded on deep sea. However, long before that, people were already crossing the oceans, as proven not by the Ra-2 expedition, not even by the many coincidences in ancient drawings, but mostly by the fact the European navigators found people living everywhere they landed, even in the most remote island, on the biggest ocean. I'd say ancient primitive people got to these isolated places by boat. Still, academics persist in denial, repeating their paper consensus for a land-based migration, leaving us with a problem. If they, the paper pushers, push for disproven ideas like the Americas being colonized exclusively on foot via nearly the North Pole during an ice age instead of by boat, as evidently it was done, how can we trust anything else the academics say? Here's the thing. For many millennia, long before the Portuguese round trip, one-way contact and even colonization was already a common thing, with people traveling to odd places, even if by accident, and then talking about stuff they liked, thus offering a likely way to share all those mysterious ideas called coincidences. Well, not quite all of the ancient coincidences, because the Cyclopean walls cannot be shared by a simple castaway. It is all fine and dandy to get lost in the sea and end up explaining to the natives in some random island how to draw fish scales and handbags. It is not as easy to share a complex building technique, furthermore, one that to this day we do not even know how it was done. That is why, regardless of all the trips across the oceans made by ancient and new people alike, Cyclopean walls remain the biggest mystery in antiquity and an endless source for wonder, or at least YouTube videos, like the next one, visiting the original Cyclops, the Pelasgian. That's it for today. Hope you liked it. See you in the comments.